Jacob Arlen had once believed that accepting a teaching contract on another planet would at least be predictable. Strange, perhaps. Interesting, certainly. But predictable. Standing in the center of the Elyndran royal palace, surrounded by hovering silver lights and walls that softly pulsed with living crystal technology, he was beginning to suspect he had made a serious miscalculation. The palace itself looked less like a building and more like a piece of art someone had accidentally turned into architecture. Curved towers stretched toward a pale violet sky visible through enormous open arches. Transparent platforms floated gently between levels, gliding like quiet clouds whenever someone stepped onto them. Even the floor beneath Jacob's shoes shimmered faintly, as if the stone was quietly thinking about something important. Jacob adjusted the strap of his bag and muttered under his breath, "Okay, alien palace. Totally normal. Nothing weird yet." A nearby royal guard heard him and gave a polite but confused nod. The guard looked human at first glance, except for the long, elegant ears rising through his dark hair like sculpted points. Every Elyndran had them. Long ears, calm eyes, and the unsettling habit of looking composed even when someone else was panicking. Jacob was definitely the panicking one. A tall advisor in flowing white robes approached him with dignified steps. "Teacher Jacob Arlen," the advisor said. "That's me," Jacob replied, still trying to process that someone thought hiring a human teacher from Earth was a good idea. "The princess has expressed interest in learning about human culture." Jacob nodded slowly. "Right. Earth culture. I can handle that. Movies, food, awkward holidays, the universal human fear of stepping on a Lego brick." The advisor blinked once, clearly unsure whether Lego brick was a military threat. They walked together through a vast corridor where glowing plants grew along the walls in elegant spirals. Jacob noticed small floating drones trimming the plants with precise beams of light. "Those are gardeners?" he asked. "Maintenance constructs." "Ah," Jacob said. "Laser gardening, of course. Very advanced." They eventually reached an enormous chamber filled with sunlight pouring through a ceiling of transparent crystal. At the far end stood a woman so poised and commanding that Jacob immediately knew who she was: Queen Talia. She looked strikingly human except for the long ears that swept back through her dark hair. Her posture carried effortless authority, and her silver armor-like dress shimmered with subtle alien technology that shifted patterns like flowing light. Two silent guards stood several steps behind her. Jacob suddenly became very aware that he was holding a backpack filled with children's books and a tablet containing cartoons. He cleared his throat. "Your Majesty." Queen Talia studied him carefully, not rudely, not suspiciously, simply with the quiet observation of someone used to judging entire political situations in a few seconds. "You are the teacher from Earth." "That's correct," Jacob said. "And before we begin, I should warn you that my teaching style sometimes involves bad jokes." The Queen raised one eyebrow. "Bad jokes?" "Very bad," Jacob admitted. A faint expression crossed her face that might have been curiosity or concern. "The princess will decide whether they are acceptable." As if summoned by the conversation, a small voice echoed across the chamber. "Is he the human?" Jacob turned. Princess Senna stood halfway across the room, staring at him with intense curiosity. She looked about 6 years old with bright, silver blue eyes and long ears that twitched slightly whenever she focused on something. Her dark hair was tied into two loose braids, and she held a small, floating toy shaped like a spinning starship. Jacob smiled and crouched slightly so he wouldn't tower over her. "Hello, Princess Senna." She walked closer, circling him slowly like a scientist examining an unusual specimen. "You look normal." Jacob nodded. "That's disappointing, I know. Humans are very unremarkable creatures most of the time." She pointed at his ears. "They're short." "Yes, we traded long ears for the ability to misplace our keys every day." The princess stared for a moment, then burst into sudden laughter. Queen Talia looked mildly surprised. Senna immediately began firing questions. "Do humans really eat circular bread with melted cheese?" "Pizza," Jacob said. "Yes, it's one of humanity's greatest achievements." "And animals sleep inside your homes?" "Correct. Some of them even take our beds." The princess gasped. "Why would you allow that?" "Because they're cute and we're weak." Another laugh escaped her. Jacob leaned slightly closer and whispered conspiratorially, "Also, humans sometimes trip over absolutely nothing while walking. That makes no sense." Exactly. The princess was laughing so hard now that the floating starship toy bobbed wildly around her head. Queen Talia watched the exchange from several steps away. Something in her daughter's laughter made her pause. Senna had not sounded like that in a long time. Eventually, the princess wiped her eyes and looked at Jacob with sudden seriousness. She studied him for several long seconds as if solving a complicated puzzle. Then she turned toward her mother and declared with perfect certainty, "I choose him." Jacob blinked. "Choose me for what?" Senna pointed proudly at him. "For my father." The chamber fell completely silent. One guard nearly dropped his spear. The royal advisor inhaled sharply. Somewhere behind them, a hovering maintenance drone froze midair, as if even it sensed something catastrophic had just happened. Jacob looked around nervously. "Did I miss something important?" Queen Talia slowly closed her eyes. Because on Elyndra, the words Senna had just spoken were not a child's joke. They were law. For several long seconds after Senna's declaration, no one moved. The palace chamber remained perfectly silent, except for the faint humming of the living crystal walls and the quiet floating buzz of the maintenance drone, still hovering awkwardly in midair. Jacob looked from the princess to the queen, then to the advisor, and finally back to the princess again. "Well," he said slowly, "that was a very confident sentence." No one laughed. That made him nervous. Princess Senna stood proudly with her hands behind her back, looking extremely pleased with herself. She had clearly made an important decision and expected everyone else to accept it immediately. Jacob raised a finger carefully. "I just want to clarify something," he said. "When you say you choose me as your father, is this like a symbolic thing? Like when kids on Earth say they want a dinosaur as a pet?" The royal advisor made a faint choking sound. Queen Talia opened her eyes again, and for a moment Jacob saw something rare there. Not anger, not authority, pure disbelief. "Princess Senna," the queen said carefully, "you understand what you have declared." "Yes," Senna said happily. The advisor stepped forward, his long robes swaying nervously. "Your Majesty, perhaps the princess is joking." "I am not joking," Senna replied immediately. "He tells good stories." Jacob scratched the side of his head. "I appreciate the endorsement." The advisor turned pale. One of the guards whispered to the other, "This has not happened since the Third Crown era." The second guard whispered back, 412 years. Jacob heard that and blinked slowly. "Okay," he said. "I feel like I'm missing a very important piece of information." Queen Talia finally looked directly at him. "Teacher Jacob," she said calmly, "on Elyndra, when a royal heir chooses a parental bond, it activates an ancient succession law." Jacob nodded thoughtfully. "Ancient succession law," he repeated. "That already sounds expensive." The advisor cleared his throat and produced a small holographic tablet. With a subtle gesture, a glowing legal document appeared in the air between them. "According to the emotional stability doctrine," the advisor began with painful seriousness, "if the royal heir forms a declared parental attachment after the loss of one parent, the crown must ensure that emotional bond becomes permanent." Jacob leaned forward slightly. "I'm going to regret asking this," he said. The advisor continued. "The surviving monarch must marry the individual chosen by the heir." Jacob stared at the hologram. Then he looked at the queen. Then he looked at the princess. Then he looked back at the hologram again. "Well," he said after a moment, "that escalated quickly." Senna nodded happily. "I told you he was smart." Queen Talia pinched the bridge of her nose, as if fighting a headache that had arrived from another galaxy. "This law has not been invoked in centuries," she muttered. Jacob raised his hand again. "Hypothetically," he said, "if someone were to say, misinterpret the princess's statement." "The law recognizes the heir's words," the advisor interrupted. Jacob tried again. "Okay, hypothetically again. What if the teacher is very bad at being a father?" Senna immediately protested. "You are not bad." "I once killed a houseplant by forgetting it existed," Jacob said. "That is irrelevant," Senna replied firmly. The advisor looked deeply uncomfortable. "The declaration has already been recorded by the palace intelligence system." Jacob turned slowly toward the ceiling. Of course the room has recording software. The hovering maintenance drone suddenly beeped and quietly drifted away, as if it wanted absolutely nothing to do with the situation. Queen Talia straightened and regained some of her royal composure. "Teacher Jacob," she said, "this situation is unexpected. That is a very polite way of saying catastrophic. The law cannot be ignored." Jacob rubbed his face. "I accepted a tutoring job," he said. "I did not realize I was applying for interstellar stepfather." Senna tugged gently on his sleeve. "You would be good at it." Jacob looked down at her. "Based on what evidence?" "You explained pizza," he sighed. "That is unfortunately one of my strongest qualifications." The royal advisor began nervously scrolling through the holographic law document. "There is one procedural step," he said. Queen Talia turned toward him. "What step?" "A verification period." Jacob brightened slightly. "That sounds promising." "The chosen individual must live in the palace for a 3-month bonding evaluation with the heir." Jacob blinked. "So, I move in?" "Yes." "And if the bond is confirmed?" The advisor hesitated. "The marriage becomes legally unavoidable." Jacob stared at the ceiling again. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "when people say teaching abroad changes your life, this is not what they usually mean." Senna grabbed his hand triumphantly. "Good. You can start teaching me tomorrow." Jacob looked down at her. "What would you like to learn first?" The princess thought carefully. "Why humans laugh at jokes that are not logical." Jacob smiled faintly. "Well, princess," he said, glancing at the stunned royal court around them, "today might be a very good example." Behind them, Queen Talia stood perfectly still, silently wondering how a quiet teaching contract had somehow turned into the most politically impossible situation in the history of her throne. The palace assigned Jacob Arlen a suite that was roughly the size of his entire apartment back on Earth. It contained 3 rooms, a floating desk that followed him whenever he walked too far away from it, a wall that changed color depending on his mood, and a bed that quietly adjusted its softness every time he turned over. Jacob stared at the bed for a long moment. "I miss gravity," he said to no one in particular. The room politely dimmed its lighting as if offering sympathy. 3 days earlier, he had been a tutor arriving for a simple cultural exchange program. Now he was officially living inside an alien royal palace under what the advisors called a bonding evaluation protocol. Jacob called it the strangest job promotion in human history. A soft chime echoed through the room. Before Jacob could answer, the door slid open and Princess Senna marched in with absolute authority. Behind her floated 2 hovering security drones and 1 extremely nervous palace attendant. "Good morning, Father Candidate," Senna announced. Jacob blinked. "I feel like that title needs some work." "You must begin my Earth lessons. It's 7 in the morning." "Learning is important." Jacob rubbed his eyes. "Princess, on Earth we usually begin the day with something called coffee." "What is coffee?" "An emergency survival beverage." Senna tilted her head thoughtfully. "Is it dangerous?" "Only if you don't have it." The attendant cleared her throat awkwardly. "Your Highness, perhaps the tutor requires preparation time." Senna shook her head. "No, humans improvise." Jacob sighed. "She's not wrong." Within minutes, Jacob found himself sitting on a balcony overlooking the immense city of Elyndra. Towers of luminous metal curved toward the sky, while streams of small spacecraft moved quietly between them like glowing insects. Far below, hovering vehicles drifted along transparent transit lanes that shimmered in the morning light. Jacob took a sip from the cup the palace had provided. "This is not coffee," he said. The attendant bowed apologetically. "It is Elyndran nutrient infusion. It tastes like someone boiled a library." Senna laughed. Jacob leaned back in his chair. "All right, lesson 1, Earth culture." Senna immediately raised her hand. "Yes, Princess?" "Why do humans laugh?" Jacob thought about it. "Because life is weird." That is not a scientific explanation. "It's the correct one." She leaned forward eagerly. "Tell me a human joke." Jacob glanced toward the royal security drones floating nearby. "All right, here's a simple one. Why did the astronaut break up with his girlfriend?" Senna waited. "Because he needed space." There was silence. The princess stared at him. The drones hovered quietly. The attendant looked concerned. Jacob nodded slowly. Yes, that reaction happens sometimes. Then Senna suddenly burst into laughter so loud that one of the drones briefly spun in confusion. That joke is terrible. Exactly. They spent the next hour discussing Earth traditions. Senna learned about birthday parties, pets, movies, and something called board games. She seemed especially fascinated by the concept of humans voluntarily watching scary stories. Why would someone want to feel fear for entertainment? She asked. Jacob shrugged. Good question. Humans are strange creatures. A quiet voice spoke from behind them. That much is becoming clear. Jacob turned. Queen Talia stood at the entrance of the balcony. She had arrived so silently that even the security drones hadn't reacted yet. Sunlight caught the silver lines of her elegant armor dress, giving her an almost otherworldly presence against the bright sky. Senna waved enthusiastically. Mother, Jacob told me a joke about astronauts. The queen stepped closer. I heard the laughter from 3 corridors away. Jacob lifted his cup slightly. Would your majesty like some library soup? The queen looked at the drink. You mean the nutrient infusion? That is a generous name for it. Senna giggled again. Queen Talia studied the human teacher carefully. For several days she had watched him interact with Senna. She had expected awkwardness, hesitation, perhaps even fear. Instead, the man behaved as if the palace was simply a slightly unusual classroom. He never tried to impress anyone. He never acted intimidated. In fact, he had once asked a palace engineer if the anti-gravity elevators could be used to deliver pizza. The engineer was still researching the possibility. Teacher Jacob, the queen said calmly, how do you find the palace so far? Jacob considered the question seriously. It's beautiful, terrifying, and I still don't understand how the bathroom mirror predicts my hairstyle before I wake up. That is a grooming assistant. It judged me this morning. Senna laughed again. Queen Talia felt something unfamiliar tug at her composure. The palace had been quiet since the king's death. Too quiet. Now laughter echoed through its halls again. It was unsettling, but not unpleasant. Senna leaned toward Jacob. Tell another joke. Jacob sighed dramatically. All right, but this one is very advanced human humor. The queen folded her arms with mild curiosity. Jacob leaned closer and whispered loudly, why don't aliens visit Earth? Senna waited. Because they looked at our internet and decided the planet was too dangerous. The princess exploded with laughter again. Even one of the security drones produced a confused beep. Queen Talia did not laugh, but the corner of her mouth moved slightly, and that alone was enough to shock the palace attendant more than any alien technology ever had. Life inside the Elyndran royal palace quickly developed a strange rhythm for Jacob Arlen. Mornings began with Princess Senna arriving before sunrise with new questions about Earth. Afternoons involved cultural lessons that somehow turned into games. Evenings usually ended with Jacob trying to understand alien devices that seemed designed specifically to confuse humans. On the 10th day of the bonding period, Jacob discovered the palace library. Calling it a library felt inaccurate. The chamber was enormous, stretching upward into a dome where transparent rings of light slowly rotated like quiet planets. Instead of shelves, thousands of glowing data spheres floated gently through the air. Whenever someone reached for one, the sphere would drift closer and project its information into a holographic display. Jacob stood beneath the dome, staring upward. Okay, he said quietly. This is officially the coolest library in the universe. Princess Senna stood beside him, holding a floating sphere that displayed rotating images of ancient starships. I told you our library was better than Earth libraries. Jacob folded his arms thoughtfully. Earth libraries do not have floating knowledge planets. Exactly. Jacob reached for one of the spheres drifting nearby. It floated down into his hand and immediately projected a complex holographic map of Elyndran history. He leaned closer. Your people have been traveling between star systems for over 2,000 years? Yes. And this library contains all of that? Yes. Jacob whistled. That's a lot of homework. Senna tilted her head. You like learning? I do, Jacob admitted, but usually my libraries don't judge me. The sphere flickered slightly as if offended. They spent nearly an hour exploring historical recordings. Some showed enormous Elyndran fleets traveling between stars. Others displayed peaceful cities glowing beneath unfamiliar constellations. Then Senna quietly selected a different sphere. This one projected an image of a tall Elyndran man standing beside Queen Talia. Jacob immediately understood. "That's your father." Senna nodded. King Arvel looked calm and thoughtful, with the same long ears and composed posture as most Elyndrans. The recording showed him walking through the palace gardens with a much younger Senna sitting on his shoulders. Jacob remained silent. After a moment, Senna said softly, "He used to tell stories about the stars." Jacob crouched slightly so they were at the same level. "What kind of stories?" "He said every star had travelers watching other stars." Jacob smiled gently. "That's actually a very good theory. Do humans believe that?" "Some do." Senna watched the hologram carefully. "Mother stopped telling stories after he disappeared." Jacob nodded slowly. Grief did that sometimes. He glanced around the vast library, searching for something lighter. Then he spotted a floating holographic interface labeled Galactic Wildlife Records. Jacob's eyes lit up. "Princess, would you like to see something interesting?" Senna wiped her eyes quickly and nodded. Jacob opened the wildlife archive. Instantly, dozens of holographic creatures appeared around them, some enormous, some tiny, some glowing faintly with alien biology. Senna gasped. "What are those?" "Animals from other planets." She pointed at a six-legged creature with bright feathers. "That one looks ridiculous." "That one probably thinks the same thing about humans." They continued browsing. One creature looked like a floating jellyfish with wings. Another resembled a walking crystal formation. Then Jacob opened a file labeled Earth Animals. Suddenly, a holographic cow appeared in the middle of the library. It mooed. Senna jumped back in shock. "What is that?" "That," Jacob said proudly, "is a cow. It is enormous, and it produces milk." "Why?" "Honestly," Jacob said, "humans are still debating that." Senna began laughing again. The holographic cow slowly walked through several drifting data spheres, causing them to wobble slightly. A voice spoke from the library entrance. "I was wondering why the Wildlife Archive had activated." Jacob turned. Queen Talia stood at the doorway, watching the holographic cow calmly chewing invisible grass. For a moment she said nothing. Then she asked, "Teacher Jacob, is that animal supposed to be inside the library?" Jacob scratched the back of his neck. "It's educational." Senna ran toward her mother. "Jacob says humans drink the animal." The queen blinked. "You drink it?" "Not the whole cow," Jacob clarified quickly. "Just the milk." Queen Talia looked at the holographic animal again. "That is a deeply confusing species." Jacob nodded. "Humans say the same thing about humans." Senna giggled. The queen watched the two of them carefully. Senna looked brighter these days, lighter. The shadow that had followed her since the king vanished seemed thinner. Jacob deactivated the hologram and the cow vanished quietly. "Sorry about the library disruption, Your Majesty." Queen Talia stepped closer. "You have not disrupted anything." Her gaze shifted to Senna, who was already reaching for another floating data sphere. Then the queen looked back at Jacob. "You have changed the atmosphere of the palace." Jacob blinked. "Hopefully not in a bad way." "Not bad," she said quietly. For a brief moment, something almost like warmth appeared in her expression. Senna suddenly turned toward them with excitement. "Jacob, there is a game in this archive." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "A game?" She activated the sphere. Instantly, a holographic board appeared in the air between them, filled with glowing geometric pieces. Jacob stared. "Princess, is this alien chess?" "Yes." He examined the board. There were 27 types of pieces. They moved on multiple levels. One of them was labeled Quantum Admiral. Jacob leaned back slowly. "I'm going to lose this game very badly." Senna grinned. "Yes." Queen Talia watched the scene quietly. For the first time in many months, the palace library was filled with laughter instead of silence. By the second week of Jacob Arlen's unexpected residence in the Elyndran palace, the royal staff had developed a new habit. They quietly followed him. Not openly, of course. Elyndran palace etiquette was far too refined for something as obvious as staring. Instead, attendants appeared in nearby corridors at suspiciously convenient moments. Guards paused longer than necessary during patrols. Even the hovering maintenance drones drifted slowly through rooms where Jacob happened to be teaching Princess Senna. The reason was simple. The palace had started laughing again. On this particular afternoon, Jacob stood in the middle of the royal gardens, holding what looked like two long metallic sticks connected by glowing threads of light. Princess Senna sat cross-legged on the grass in front of him. "This," Jacob announced proudly, "is called a kite." Senna studied the object carefully. "It does not look like a creature." "That's because it's not alive." "Then why does it fly?" Jacob pointed toward the sky where soft winds moved between the floating towers of the palace city. "Air currents." Senna frowned thoughtfully. "You mean invisible forces?" "Exactly." She stood and grabbed the handle. "What happens now?" Jacob smiled. "Now we test it." He released the device. The kite instantly shot upward, glowing brightly as it caught the wind between the palace structures. It spun once, then stabilized and drifted high above the garden like a tiny artificial star. Senna's eyes widened. "It is flying!" "That's the entire point." She laughed loudly and began running across the garden while holding the glowing control string. Behind them, two palace guards stood near a silver tree, pretending very badly not to watch. One whispered to the other, "Is that human technology?" "I believe it is. Recreational equipment." "Why would someone build technology for fun?" "I do not know." Jacob jogged after Senna before she accidentally launched the kite into a royal sculpture. "Careful, if you crash that into the Queen's statue, I'm probably getting deported." Senna stopped suddenly. "What is deported?" "It means I get sent back to Earth very quickly." She considered this seriously. "That would be inconvenient." "Yes," Jacob agreed. "For both of us." A soft voice spoke behind them. "I am curious how a glowing flying object is considered education." Jacob turned. Queen Talia stood at the edge of the garden walkway, observing the scene with composed interest. The breeze moved gently through her dark hair, and the silver threads of her royal attire shimmered faintly in the sunlight. Senna waved excitedly. "Mother! Jacob made the wind toy!" The queen looked at the kite drifting high above the palace. "It appears effective." Jacob shrugged. "On Earth, we use them mostly to entertain children. And here you are using them to entertain a princess." "That too." Senna tugged the control thread proudly. "It listens to me," Jacob nodded, "because you're holding the control. Like commanding a starship." "That's actually a very good comparison." The princess suddenly grew very serious. "I am the kite admiral." Jacob placed a hand on his chin thoughtfully. "That promotion happened quickly." Senna ran past them again, laughing. Queen Talia watched her daughter carefully. The sound of Senna's laughter echoed across the gardens, carried by the wind through the silver trees and glowing flowers. It had been a long time since the garden sounded like that. The queen spoke quietly. "She smiles more now." Jacob followed Senna with his eyes as she chased the glowing kite. "She's a smart kid. She was not like this after the king disappeared." Jacob nodded slowly. "Grief can make the world feel very quiet." Queen Talia studied him for a moment. "You speak as if you understand." Jacob looked at the sky. "My father passed away when I was young." The queen remained silent. Jacob shrugged slightly. "For a while everything felt strange, like the universe had lost one of its stars." The queen's long ears tilted slightly as she listened. "But eventually," Jacob continued, "other stars start becoming visible again." Senna suddenly ran back toward them. "Jacob!" The wind changed. The kite jerked sideways and began spinning wildly. Jacob grabbed the control thread quickly. "Okay, that's not supposed to happen." The glowing device shot upward, pulling harder. Senna gasped. "Is it escaping?" "That would be embarrassing." The kite suddenly accelerated and shot directly toward one of the floating palace towers. Jacob yanked the controls desperately. "Come back here!" The two nearby guards stepped forward cautiously. "Do we need to intercept the object?" Jacob gritted his teeth. "No, I think I—" The kite slammed into a decorative energy field around the tower and bounced harmlessly away before drifting back toward them. Jacob slowly exhaled. Have it under control. Senna burst into laughter again. You almost lost the wind toy. Jacob shook his head. I refuse to be defeated by recreational physics. Queen Talia watched the scene with quiet amusement. You appear to bring chaos wherever you go, Teacher Jacob. Jacob handed the control back to Senna. I prefer the term creative disruption. The princess lifted the glowing string again. I am still the kite admiral. Jacob bowed slightly. Yes, Admiral. Senna giggled and ran off again. For several moments, Queen Talia said nothing. Then she looked at Jacob with an expression that was no longer entirely formal. You did not come here seeking influence? Jacob raised an eyebrow. I came here to teach pizza jokes. And yet, the Queen said softly, watching Senna laugh beneath a floating kite, you may have changed the entire palace. The Elyndran palace was quieter at night. During the day, it was filled with movement. Guards walking the luminous corridors, advisors debating politics in distant chambers, hovering drones adjusting the delicate gardens that grew along the palace balconies. But when the stars appeared above the violet sky of Elyndra, the enormous structure seemed to breathe more slowly. Jacob Arlen had discovered that the palace roof was the best place to think. The roof was not exactly a roof. It was an enormous open terrace of smooth crystal stone that stretched high above the city. From there, the capital of Elyndra looked like a sea of glowing towers and moving lights. Streams of small starcraft crossed the sky, entering and leaving orbital gates that shimmered faintly above the planet. Jacob leaned against the balcony railing and looked upward. Earth's stars were familiar to him. He had grown up staring at them through cheap telescopes and dusty observatory glass. But Elyndra's sky was different. The constellations were wrong. Entire clusters of distant galaxies shimmered where nothing should have been. It made him feel very small. He sipped from the cup in his hand and immediately grimaced. That is still not coffee. A calm voice spoke behind him. You say that every evening. Jacob turned. Queen Talia stood at the entrance to the terrace. The soft lights of the palace glowed behind her, outlining her tall figure against the night. The silver threads woven through her dark clothing shimmered faintly like distant stars. Jacob raised the cup slightly. I continue to hope the palace kitchen will improve. It is a nutrient infusion. It tastes like someone dissolved a book in warm water. The Queen walked toward the railing and stood beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city lights flickered below like a quiet galaxy. Princess Senna is asleep, Talia said. That's good. She demanded 2 stories before agreeing to sleep. Jacob smiled slightly. She drives a hard bargain. You created that problem. I consider it educational. The Queen glanced sideways at him. She now insists that humans invented something called pajamas. We absolutely did. Why would someone design ceremonial clothing for sleeping? Jacob laughed quietly. They're not ceremonial. They are matching. That's part of the magic. Talia shook her head faintly, though the corner of her mouth moved just slightly. The silence returned for a few moments. Below them, a long silver cruiser slowly drifted across the sky, its engines glowing softly as it moved toward the orbital ring above the planet. Jacob watched it. That ship is enormous. It is a diplomatic carrier. How many people live on something like that? 3,000. Jacob let out a slow whistle. You Elyndrans do everything on a slightly larger scale than humans. Your species travels between stars and smaller vessels. We also build cities where people argue about parking spaces. The Queen tilted her head slightly. What is a parking space? Jacob thought for a moment. A location where humans compete for territory using vehicles. That sounds inefficient. It is. They stood quietly again. Eventually, the Queen spoke in a softer tone. The council is becoming impatient. Jacob glanced at her. About the bonding evaluation. Yes. 3 months is a long time to watch a human accidentally become royal family. Many nobles are concerned. About me? About the situation. Jacob nodded slowly. That's fair. The Queen studied him carefully. You do not seem concerned. Oh, I'm concerned, Jacob said. I'm just trying not to panic in a very expensive palace. Marriage to the crown is not something one accepts lightly. Jacob rubbed the back of his neck. Trust me, I did not wake up on Earth expecting to marry an alien queen. That is fortunate. Jacob glanced sideways at her. Why? Because I did not expect it either. For a moment, the two of them shared a quiet understanding. Far below, the city lights shifted as night transports moved through the glowing skyways. Jacob leaned slightly on the railing. Can I ask you something? You may. Why does that law exist? The Queen looked out over the city. It was created after a tragic era in our history. Several heirs were raised without strong emotional bonds after losing parents during war. When they became rulers, they governed with cold logic, which is bad. Compassion disappeared from the throne. Jacob nodded. So the law forces the crown to protect the emotional stability of the heir. Yes, that's actually a very human idea. The Queen turned toward him slightly. Is it? Humans pretend we're logical creatures, Jacob said, but most of our decisions are emotional. The Queen considered that. You influence Senna strongly. I just tell her stories. You make her laugh. That part is easy. Talia watched the lights of the city again. She has not laughed like this since her father vanished. Jacob remained quiet. After a moment, he said gently, You miss him too. The Queen did not answer immediately, but her silence said enough. Jacob lifted his cup again and sighed. Still terrible. The Queen glanced at the drink. You could request a different beverage. I tried, and they gave me something that glowed. That is medicinal tea. It tried to vibrate. The Queen actually laughed. It was brief, soft, and completely unguarded. Jacob blinked. That's the first time I've heard you laugh. Talia straightened slightly, regaining her composure. It will not become a habit. Of course not. Another quiet moment passed. Then Jacob looked up at the unfamiliar stars again. You know, he said thoughtfully, this might be the strangest chapter of my life. You are not alone in that thought. Jacob nodded toward the city below. But it's also kind of amazing. The Queen followed his gaze across the glowing capital of Elyndra. For the first time in a long while, the future of the throne felt uncertain in a way that was not entirely frightening, and that realization lingered quietly between them beneath the alien stars. The final day of the bonding evaluation arrived with a sky so clear that the orbital ring of Elyndra glowed like a silver halo above the planet. Jacob Arlen stood in the royal assembly chamber, trying very hard not to look nervous. He was failing. The chamber was enormous, built from smooth crystal walls that curved upward into a dome filled with slowly drifting lights. Hundreds of Elyndran nobles sat in quiet rows, their long ears angled forward with curiosity as they watched the strange human who had somehow become the center of the most unusual royal situation in centuries. Jacob adjusted the collar of the formal jacket the palace had given him. I feel like I'm about to take a final exam, he muttered. Beside him, Princess Senna squeezed his hand confidently. You will pass. I hope so. You taught me about pizza. That is not strong legal evidence. Across the chamber, Queen Talia stood beside the royal council. She wore ceremonial armor woven with threads of silver energy that shimmered faintly as she moved. Her posture was calm, but Jacob could see the tension in the slight stillness of her shoulders. The council advisor stepped forward and activated a holographic display that expanded into the center of the room. Today marks the conclusion of the emotional stability evaluation period, the advisor announced. The bond between the royal heir and the chosen individual must be confirmed before the law is enacted. Jacob leaned slightly toward Senna. Just so we're clear, he whispered, this is the part where everyone judges me. Senna nodded happily. Yes, that's comforting. The advisor continued. For 3 months, teacher Jacob Arlen has resided within the palace. Observations have been conducted by council members, palace intelligence systems, and the Royal Psychological Archives. Jacob blinked. Wait, the palace has psychological archives? Yes, Senna whispered. That sounds invasive. The holographic display shifted, showing recordings from the previous weeks. One image showed Jacob in the garden trying to control the runaway kite while Senna laughed. Another showed the holographic cow wandering through the palace library. A third recording captured Jacob explaining why humans sometimes name pets ridiculous things like Captain Whiskers. The nobles murmured quietly. Jacob rubbed his forehead. Please tell me they didn't record the pajama explanation. They did, Senna whispered. Wonderful. The advisor paused the hologram and looked toward the council. The evidence indicates a consistent emotional bond between the heir and the subject. Jacob raised a hand. Subject is not my favorite word. Senna tugged his sleeve. It means you. I figured. The advisor continued calmly. The princess demonstrates increased emotional stability, laughter frequency, and social engagement. Jacob whispered, laughter frequency sounds like a medical condition. Senna giggled. The council members began quietly discussing among themselves. Some nodded. Others observed Jacob carefully. Finally, the advisor turned toward the queen. Your Majesty, the evaluation is complete. Queen Talia stepped forward. The chamber became silent. Jacob suddenly realized that this moment mattered far more than he had allowed himself to admit. 3 months earlier, he had arrived as a teacher with a bag full of books and bad jokes. Now an entire civilization was waiting for the result. Talia looked at her daughter first. Princess Senna, she said gently, do you still choose this man as your father? Senna did not hesitate. Yes. The word echoed softly through the chamber. The queen turned her gaze toward Jacob. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jacob gave a small nervous shrug. I still don't fully understand alien royal dinner etiquette, he said. A few quiet chuckles spread through the chamber. Talia's expression softened just slightly. Teacher Jacob, she said calmly, during these months you have brought something unexpected into this palace. Jacob waited. Joy. The word lingered in the air. The queen continued. My daughter laughs again. The palace breathes again. Even the council chambers have become less unbearable. Several advisors coughed politely. Jacob smiled faintly. That might be the nicest performance review I've ever received. The queen looked toward the council. The law is clear. The bond is genuine. The advisor nodded. Then the emotional stability doctrine requires formal recognition of the parental bond. A ripple of quiet reaction moved through the nobles. Jacob leaned toward Senna again. This is the part where my life becomes extremely complicated, isn't it? Yes. All right. The advisor spoke once more. Jacob Arlen of Earth, by the law of Elyndra, you are recognized as the chosen parental bond of the royal heir. Jacob exhaled slowly. And that means, the advisor finished calmly, you must marry Queen Talia. Senna beamed triumphantly. I told you. The chamber filled with quiet discussion as nobles absorbed the reality of the declaration. Jacob looked at the queen. Well, he said gently, this is certainly the most unusual teaching contract I've ever had. Talia studied him carefully. Do you regret it? Jacob thought for a moment. He looked at the enormous chamber, the curious nobles, the distant glow of starships through the crystal dome. Then he looked down at Senna, who was still holding his hand. Finally, he looked back at the queen. No, he said honestly. Senna squeezed both of their hands and pulled them together proudly. See? I solved everything. Jacob laughed softly. You might actually be the smartest person in this room. I know. The queen watched the two of them with an expression that no longer carried the same weight of grief it once had. Outside the palace dome, the stars of Elyndra shimmered quietly above the glowing city. 3 months earlier, Jacob Arlen had arrived as a visitor from another world. Now he stood at the beginning of a life he had never imagined, one built not from power or ambition, but from the simple and unexpected decision of a child who wanted someone to tell her stories about the stars.